What happens when one brother reportedly wants to leave the door slightly open, while the other allegedly wants to install a security system, change the locks, and quietly pretend the spare key never existed? Well, according to a report published by International Business Times UK on August 5th, that is apparently the latest chapter in the seemingly endless Harry and the royal family saga. The report claims that King Charles may be receptive to reconciliation with Prince Harry, while Prince William is reportedly far less enthusiastic about the possibility of Harry ever returning to official royal duties. And that difference is fascinating because it highlights something that has been sitting underneath this entire family dispute for years. Reconciliation and reintegration are not necessarily the same thing. You can forgive someone without giving them their old job back. You can shake someone's hand without handing them the keys to the office. And apparently, in royal terms, you can say, "Welcome home," while simultaneously saying, "Please don't touch the stationery." Now, before we get carried away, there is an important distinction here. The article itself relies on commentary and reported claims. Neither Prince William nor Prince Harry has publicly announced some grand constitutional battle over Harry's future role. Buckingham Palace has not issued a dramatic statement saying, "The spare is permanently banned from the building." So this is speculation. But it is speculation that raises a very interesting question. Could Harry ever return to working royal life? And if King Charles is genuinely more open to reconciliation than William is, who ultimately gets to decide? Because this isn't simply a story about two brothers who don't get along. It is about the difference between family and institution. Prince Harry can always be Prince Harry. He can be a son, brother, father, and member of the wider royal family. But becoming a working royal again is a completely different proposition. And that distinction may be the key to understanding why the reported disagreement between Charles and William matters so much. Let's start with King Charles. As a father, it is perfectly understandable that Charles might want some kind of reconciliation with Harry. Families are complicated. Royal families are complicated with a palace-sized side order of protocol, tradition, security concerns, public scrutiny, and approximately 17,000 cameras pointing at you whenever you breathe incorrectly. But Charles is not only Harry's father, he is the king. That means every personal decision exists alongside institutional consequences, and perhaps this is where the reported difference between Charles and William becomes particularly interesting. Charles may look at Harry and see his son. William, as the future king, may be more inclined to look at Harry and see the consequences of decisions that have already been made. That's not necessarily about hatred. It could be about trust. And trust is particularly important when you're talking about an institution where private conversations, family disagreements, and public responsibilities can become international headlines. Imagine running a company where your former executive left, wrote about the company, gave interviews about the internal culture, published a memoir, and then later wondered whether there might be a possibility of returning to the building. Most employers would probably want a meeting, and that meeting would probably begin with, "So, about that book." The Monarchy is obviously not a normal company, and the analogy only goes so far, but the fundamental issue is recognizable. If someone has stepped away from an official role and publicly discussed serious disagreements within an institution, bringing them back isn't simply a family reunion. It becomes an institutional decision. That may explain why William is reportedly more resistant. The Prince of Wales has spent years preparing for the throne. His future role depends heavily on stability, continuity, and public confidence. From that perspective, the question isn't simply, "Do I love my brother?" It is, "Would bringing my brother back into the institution strengthen or weaken it?" Those are two very different questions. And this is where the Harry debate becomes much more complicated than the headlines suggest. One of the most significant issues in the entire Harry saga is the amount of information that has entered the public domain. Harry and Meghan's departure from royal duties was followed by interviews, documentaries, public statements, and Harry's memoir. Supporters argue that Harry had every right to tell his story. Critics argue that some disclosures damaged the reputation of the royal family and made reconciliation more difficult. Both perspectives are part of the public debate. But if we temporarily remove the emotional arguments, one practical problem remains. Once private family disagreements become public, it becomes much harder to return to the old version of the relationship. That's because families normally argue behind closed doors. The royal family has historically been extraordinarily good at that. A disagreement might happen at Christmas dinner, someone might storm away from the pudding, and somehow nobody hears about it for another 30 years. The modern royal family operates in a completely different media environment. Every disagreement can become a headline. Every facial expression becomes body language analysis. Every missing birthday message becomes an international investigation. And if Harry were ever to return to an official role, the question would inevitably arise. What happens when the next disagreement occurs? Would it remain private? Would everyone trust everyone else? Would the media immediately interpret every palace photograph as evidence of another feud? That is why the issue of trust matters. The reported William position isn't necessarily, Harry is my enemy. It may be closer to, I don't know whether this arrangement could work again. And that is a much more difficult problem to solve, because you can't rebuild institutional trust simply by organizing a nice lunch. You can have tea at Windsor, you can shake hands, you can smile for photographers, but trust is built over time. And if the institution has changed since Harry left, then any potential return would have to be based on completely different expectations. There would need to be boundaries, there would need to be clarity, and perhaps most importantly, there would need to be an understanding that being family and being a working royal are separate responsibilities. This is where the debate gets particularly interesting, because even if Harry wants a closer relationship with his family, that does not automatically mean he needs a place on the royal balcony, and perhaps that is the compromise nobody talks about enough. There is a huge middle ground between total estrangement and becoming a working royal again. Harry could have a relationship with his father. He could spend time with members of the family. He could support causes that matter to him. He could participate in events connected to his charitable work. He could remain involved with the Invictus Games. He could have a relationship with his cousins. He could introduce Archie and Lilibet to their extended family. None of those things necessarily requires a formal return to royal duties, and frankly, that might be the most realistic path, because the idea of Harry returning to exactly the same role he had before 2020 is probably unrealistic. The monarchy has moved on, Harry has moved on, William has moved on, the institution has moved on, the world has moved on. You can't simply hit rewind and expect everyone to resume the conversation at the exact sentence where they left off. That's not how families work, and it's certainly not how institutions work. Perhaps what Harry needs most isn't a title, a timetable of engagements, or a position on the balcony. Perhaps it is simply a functional family relationship, and perhaps that is what Charles could be trying to preserve. Because reconciliation doesn't have to mean restoration. Sometimes reconciliation means accepting that things will never be exactly the same, and deciding that they can still be better. That would be a much more mature ending to this saga than another dramatic attempt to recreate the past. Now let's talk about William. Because it is easy to reduce this story to William hates Harry, but that is almost certainly too simplistic. William has a different constitutional future. One day, if he becomes king, every major decision he makes will be judged through the lens of the monarchy. That means William has to think beyond his personal relationship with his brother. He has to think about institutional credibility, public confidence, family stability, the future generation, and the precedent that any decision creates. Imagine William becoming king and bringing Harry back into a formal royal position. Immediately, the media would ask, why now? What has changed? What agreement was reached? Are they genuinely reconciled? Does Harry support the monarchy? Will Meghan be involved? What happens next? And if something went wrong again, the fallout would probably be even bigger, because Harry would no longer be a former working royal looking in from the outside. He would be back inside the institution. So, from William's reported perspective, keeping Harry outside official duties might actually be seen as the safer option. Not necessarily because he wants to punish his brother, but because he wants to avoid reopening a chapter that he believes caused significant disruption. And here's the uncomfortable truth for everyone involved. Harry doesn't get to decide whether the monarchy needs him. William doesn't get to decide whether Harry is allowed to be his brother. And Charles can't magically erase years of conflict with one royal handshake. Everybody has a different role. Harry can decide what kind of relationship he wants with his family. Charles can decide how he approaches his son as a father and monarch. And William, if he eventually becomes king, will have to decide what role, if any, Harry should have within the institution. Those are separate questions, and confusing them is what makes this entire debate so chaotic. So where does this leave us? If the reports are accurate, we could be looking at an important difference in approach between father and son. Charles may be more willing to leave the door open emotionally. William may be more cautious about opening the institutional door. And perhaps both positions can coexist. Because reconciliation does not require everyone to agree about the past. It requires people to decide what they want the future to look like. For Harry, that future might not involve returning as a working royal. For Charles, it might involve repairing a father-son relationship. For William, it may involve protecting the institution he is preparing to inherit. And for the royal family as a whole, the biggest challenge may be figuring out how to have a family relationship without turning every interaction into another chapter of the royal soap opera. Because let's be honest, at this point, the royal family doesn't need another season. They need a finale. But perhaps the most sensible ending isn't some grand balcony reunion with orchestral music playing in the background. Maybe it's something much quieter. A conversation, a handshake, a birthday phone call, a family gathering where nobody immediately calls a television commentator afterward. That would actually be revolutionary. The fascination with Harry's possible return will probably continue because the story represents something larger than one royal family. It's about whether damaged relationships can be repaired. It's about whether public trust can be rebuilt after private disagreements become public. And it's about whether family reconciliation requires people to forget what happened, or simply decide that they don't want to spend the rest of their lives fighting about it. As for the reported claim that William intends to permanently block Harry from royal duties, we should be careful. William is not yet king. No formal decision has been announced. And neither William nor Harry has publicly confirmed the claims described in the report. So for now, this remains a fascinating royal possibility rather than established royal policy. But if the reports are even partly reflective of the situation, one thing is becoming increasingly clear. The future of Harry's relationship with the royal family may not depend on whether one door is opened or closed. It may depend on whether everyone finally accepts that there are actually two doors. One leads to family, the other leads to the institution. And Harry may still have a chance to walk through the first one, even if the second remains firmly shut. And honestly, after everything that has happened, perhaps that isn't such a terrible outcome, because sometimes the best reconciliation isn't getting your old position back. Sometimes it's simply getting your family back. If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us for more sharp, entertaining, and balanced commentary on the ever-evolving world of the British royal family. Until next time, thank you for watching.